Welcome back to our channel, everyone.
Hi everyone, I'm Lisa.
And I'm Eric. And today we're diving into the fascinating world of interpreting body language, a vital skill for effective communication.
That's right, Eric. In this extended episode, we're going to explore key phrases and words that help us understand nonverbal cues, jump to conclusions, interpret, gesture, eye contact, not necessarily, and observe.
We'll break down each term with detailed explanations, plenty of examples, and engaging dialogues to help you use these expressions naturally in everyday conversations. So, let's get started on this journey into the language of the body. Let's start with the phrase, jump to conclusions.
Jump to conclusions means to form an opinion or make a decision about something quickly without having all the necessary facts or evidence.
For instance, imagine you see someone frowning and you immediately assume they are upset with you. That is jumping to conclusions. You're deciding based on incomplete information.
Exactly. An example in everyday conversation might be, don't jump to conclusions. Ask for clarification before you assume someone's angry.
Another scenario is when you hear a rumor and immediately believe it, without verifying its truth. For example, when I heard the news about the project, I almost jumped to conclusions before I got the full story.
It's important to be cautious with this phrase, because it reminds us that making hasty judgments can lead to misunderstandings.
Consider a dialogue. Lisa, did you see John's reaction when the boss mentioned a new policy?
Yes, but let's not jump to conclusions. Maybe he was just surprised, not upset.
In this dialogue, Lisa and Eric show that it's better to gather more information rather than assume a negative reaction.
Also, when discussing relationships or work situations, it's wise to say, I tend to jump to conclusions sometimes, but I'm learning to ask questions first.
This phrase teaches us the importance of patience and careful thinking in our interactions. Next up is the word interpret.
Interpret means to explain or understand the meaning of something, especially when it's not explicitly stated.
In the context of body language, you might interpret a smile as a sign of friendliness or a frown as a sign of displeasure.
For example, you could say, it's important to interpret body language accurately to understand what someone really means.
Another example might be, I tried to interpret his crossed arms as a sign of defensiveness, but it might have just been his way of staying warm.
This shows that while we often interpret nonverbal cues, we must be cautious because these cues can have multiple meanings.
In a conversation, you might hear, how do you interpret her silence? Implying that silence can have various interpretations, such as disinterest, contemplation, or even discomfort.
And another useful example is, when you interpret someone's body language, consider the context. What looks like annoyance might just be concentration.
Interpret is a key skill in communication, as it involves analyzing subtle cues and understanding underlying emotions.
It's not always straightforward. Sometimes the same gesture might mean different things depending on the situation or cultural background.
Now, let's explore the word gesture.
Gesture is a noun that refers to a movement of the body, especially the hands or arms, to express an idea or emotion.
For instance, waving hello or giving a thumbs up are common gestures that communicate greeting or approval without words.
You might say her friendly gesture of smiling and nodding made me feel welcome, which shows that nonverbal actions can create a positive atmosphere.
Another example is, during the conversation, he made a gesture with his hand to emphasize his point, indicating that physical movements can highlight the importance of what's being said.
Gestures can be cultural too. For example, in some cultures, a slight bow is a sign of respect, while in others, a firm handshake conveys confidence and trust.
Imagine a scenario. At the meeting, the CEO's gesture of clapping his hands signaled the end of the presentation, which is a clear nonverbal cue.
And you might add, a simple gesture like holding the door can speak volumes about your character, emphasizing that small actions matter.
It's important to notice that gestures often complement our words and can even replace them when the context is clear.
Precisely, understanding and using gestures effectively is essential for smooth communication, as they help reinforce the message.
Next, let's focus on eye contact.
Eye contact refers to the act of looking directly into someone's eyes while communicating.
In many cultures, maintaining eye contact is a sign of confidence, attentiveness, and respect.
For example, you might say, "Good eye contact during a conversation shows that you are engaged and interested."
Another example is, in interviews, candidates who maintain appropriate eye contact are often perceived as more trustworthy.
However, it's important to note that eye contact can vary by culture. In some contexts, too much eye contact might be seen as aggressive, while in others, it's a sign of sincerity.
You might also hear, "She struggled with eye contact during her presentation, which made her appear nervous."
That sentence shows how eye contact is not just about looking, but about conveying confidence and emotional connection.
In a conversation, you could add, "Always maintain proper eye contact when speaking to show you value the other person's presence."
It's a subtle yet powerful tool in both personal and professional interactions.
Eye contact helps build rapport, and being aware of it can significantly enhance your communication skills. Next, we have the phrase, "not necessarily."
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily means that something is not always or inherently true. It indicates that there can be exceptions.
For example, you might say, "A raised eyebrow doesn't necessarily mean someone is angry," implying that such a gesture could also indicate surprise or skepticism.
Another instance might be, "Just because he is quiet doesn't necessarily mean he is uninterested," suggesting that there could be other reasons for his silence.
This phrase is useful when you want to challenge assumptions and remind listeners that appearances and behaviors can be open to multiple interpretations.
In a conversation, you might hear, "Don't assume that poor eye contact means disinterest. It's not necessarily a sign of disrespect."
It's a gentle way to introduce nuance into a discussion, allowing for a broader understanding of human behavior.
When you use "not necessarily," you're indicating that a single observation should not lead to a definitive conclusion, urging caution in interpretation.
This approach is particularly important in fields like psychology and communication, where one behavior might have several explanations.
Finally, let's discuss the word observe.
Observe.
Observe means to notice or pay attention to something, often carefully or in detail.
In terms of body language, you might say, "It's important to observe someone's gestures and eye contact to understand how they really feel."
For example, you might instruct, when you're in a meeting, observe the body language of your colleagues to gauge their reactions.
Another example is, "I always observe the subtle cues in a conversation, like a shift in tone or a change in posture, to better interpret the speaker's true feelings."
Observing closely is the foundation of interpreting body language. It requires paying attention to every detail, from gestures to eye contact and even facial expressions.
And remember, what you observe might not be clear-cut. As we've discussed, people can jump to conclusions if they don't take the time to fully interpret the signals correctly.
For instance, you might say, "Don't observe just one aspect of their behavior. Consider the context and other nonverbal cues as well."
That's why it's crucial to observe multiple signals before forming an opinion.
It's all about being attentive and cautious, ensuring that you understand the full picture.
In summary, learning to observe effectively can improve your ability to read body language and enhance your interpersonal communication skills.
Now that we've covered each term individually, let's explore how these concepts work together in the context of interpreting body language.
Absolutely. Consider a scenario where you're in a job interview. You might observe the candidate's gestures. Are they using open hand movements or are they crossing their arms?
Right, and you might note that their eye contact is steady, which typically draws attention to their confidence.
But it's important not to jump to conclusions. For instance, if the candidate briefly looks away, it does not necessarily mean they are untrustworthy. It might just be a moment of nervousness or thoughtfulness.
You have to interpret these signals carefully. For example, a slight smile combined with warm eye contact might indicate genuine friendliness.
Conversely, if someone's body language is closed off, perhaps they're fidgeting or making minimal eye contact, You might observe that as a sign of discomfort or anxiety.
However, remember, a lack of eye contact does not necessarily mean the person is dishonest or uninterested. Cultural differences can influence such behaviors.
Exactly. Now let's imagine another scenario, a group meeting at work.
In that setting, you might observe a colleague who often jumps to conclusions during discussions, quickly interpreting others' comments without waiting for clarification.
This behavior can lead to misunderstandings, so it's important to encourage a habit of thoughtful observation before reacting.
Meanwhile, you might notice someone who uses a lot of gestures to emphasize their points.
Their animated gestures can draw attention to their enthusiasm and passion for the project, helping others interpret their ideas more clearly.
And then there's the matter of not necessarily.
Yes, that phrase is crucial. For instance, when you observe someone in a meeting, you might think, their frown does not necessarily mean they disagree. They might just be deep in thought.
Using not necessarily reminds us to consider alternative explanations before forming judgments.
It's a useful tool to keep our interpretations flexible and open-minded, which is essential in effective communication.
Imagine you're talking with a friend about a recent conversation. You might say, I observed that he kept fidgeting during our chat, but that does not necessarily mean he was bored. He might just have been nervous.
That's a perfect example of how context matters.
In another case, suppose you're at a party. You might observe someone who is very animated, using grand gestures, making solid eye contact, and smiling broadly.
You could interpret these signs as them being genuinely happy and engaged, but remember, you should avoid jumping to conclusions.
Exactly. Always look for more context.
These nuances in body language are why it's so important to observe carefully and interpret with an open mind.
Now, let's discuss how you can practice these skills in your daily life.
One great tip is to consciously observe people in everyday settings, like at a cafe or during a meeting, and try to interpret their gestures and eye contact.
Ask yourself, what might this behavior mean? Am I jumping to conclusions too quickly, or should I consider other possibilities?
You can even note in your journal, today I observed that my colleague's lack of eye contact did not necessarily indicate disinterest. He was simply focused on his notes.
Reflecting like this can improve your ability to understand nonverbal cues over time.
And remember, the goal is not to become a mind reader, but to enhance your communication skills and build better relationships.
Whether it's in professional settings like meetings and interviews, or personal situations like conversations with friends, these skills can help you interact more effectively.
By learning to observe carefully and interpret body language accurately, you can avoid misunderstandings and build stronger connections with others.
So, take your time to observe the subtleties of human behavior. Notice the small gestures, the fleeting eye contact, and even the moments when people jump to conclusions.
And use the phrase "not necessarily" as a reminder to keep an open mind about what those signals might mean.
These tools empower you to see beyond the surface, to understand not just what is being said, but what is truly being communicated.
We hope this deep dive into interpreting body language has provided you with practical insights and valuable vocabulary that you can apply in your daily life.
Remember, effective communication is as much about what you say as it is about what you observe nonverbally.
So, next time you're in a conversation, take a moment to interpret the body language around you, and don't jump to conclusions. Consider all the possibilities and not necessarily assume the worst.
Practice these strategies in your everyday interactions, and you'll soon notice an improvement in your ability to read people and respond appropriately.
Thank you for joining us on this extensive exploration of body language interpretation. We hope you found our examples and explanations helpful.
Keep honing your skills, stay curious about the nonverbal cues around you, and let your understanding of body language enhance your communication.
We appreciate your time and hope you'll join us again in our next episode for more insightful lessons in English conversation.
Until then, happy observing, keep an open mind, and never stop learning.
Bye for now, everyone.
See you in the next episode.